Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. My name is Dr. Brian Rade, and today I am joined by a nutrition specialist. Her name is Justine Stenger. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. I'll double check when I bring her into the interview. So Justine practices in Calgary, Alberta, a fellow Canadian. I haven't really had too many Canadians on the podcast so far, just a couple. So happy to have another one on board. And she practices at a clinic called the Hoffman Center, where they do a lot of really awesome integrative treatments. So I reached out to Justine to see if she would be willing to be a guest on my podcast because she has a lot of great social media content. She posts videos all the time on Instagram. I see videos in my feed from her every day, pretty much every day, every weekday anyways, I think. And she talks a lot about phospholipids. And phospholipids is a topic that's really important for mitochondrial health, cellular health in general, in particular for mitochondrial health. And so I'm excited to pick her brain about that. And just recently I saw she posted some videos about other interesting topics like methylene blue and molecular hydrogen. And just seems like she's interested in a lot of really interesting topics, and seems like she has a lot of experience with different areas that would be helpful for folks dealing with complex chronic illness. So I'm looking forward to my chat with her. Just before I bring her into the interview, into the meeting here, just a quick mention that if you're not already subscribed to my mailing list, please consider doing so. The link to do that is in the show notes for the podcast, or if you're watching this on episodes, in the comment section below. By signing up for my mailing list, you get access to the first 2 modules of my Overcoming Chronic Illness course, and you're also on my mailing list. So if I have live Q&As or just other things that I'm interested in, excited about in practice, then you'll be the first to know if you're on that mailing list. So I see that Justine is ready to go with the interview, so I'm going to pause the recording for a second, and I'll be right back with her. All right, everyone. Well, I'm back with Justine Stenger. And Justine, thanks so much for joining me today. Very excited to chat with you about a lot of different topics like phospholipids. And I heard you recently posted a video about methylene blue and molecular hydrogen. And I'm sure you're into a lot of other cool stuff based on the Instagram posts I've seen of yours over the last several months. So thank you for joining me. And do you mind just telling the audience a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in working with folks dealing with complex chronic illnesses?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. My journey in chronic complex illness really started with myself, which is why I think a lot of us who are in this field really got into this field because of our own health journey. So I ended up getting connected with Bruce Hoffman in 2012. And that was my connection with him was really what was the catalyst to me going and pursuing my education through IFM and getting connected with some really phenomenal lipid researchers. And that's how I fell in love with cell membrane medicine, which is my area of expertise now, and really all that I study and all that I teach for the most part. And I also work with Bruce through the Hoffman Center for Integrative Medicine. I work with his patients. So he's primarily working with patients that have mast cell activation syndrome, mold illness, Lyme disease, combination of all 3. But we're seeing a lot of mast cell. I would say that's probably the main patient demographic that I am working with nutritionally now, and the main patient demographic that he sees. So that's a kind of the Coles notes of my journey. I also do, as you know, I'm a huge supporter of Body Bio products. We use them clinically, and they have a beautiful line that is designed to support the cell membrane. And so I also do clinical education for them and their practitioners. So I have my hands dipped in lots of little areas.
They're good areas to have your hands dipped into. And yeah, I was going to ask you how you got hooked up with Dr. Hoffman, because I saw that, when I was doing some research for the podcast interview, I saw, oh, you're at the Hoffman Center. And I mean, just for folks who aren't familiar with the acronym, the IFM is the Institute for Functional Medicine, kind of this like best known, most renowned institute that trains clinicians in functional medicine. So if you're a medical doctor or a nutritionist or chiropractor or someone where you're like, oh, I want to learn about integrative medicine, then this is the place to go. And yeah, just with Dr. Hoffman, really aren't that many integrative or functional medicine doctors in like medical doctors in Canada. It's such a where I mentioned in the intro, we're both Canadian, and just not that many in our country. You compare it to the States, and there's oodles and oodles. But yeah, so Dr. Hoffman's name has been whispered on the winds out in my neck of the woods. I've had some patients who have traveled all the way out there from beautiful Atlantic Canada over here. So it's great that you're working with him. As far as the mast cell activation side of it goes, sorry, did you want to say something first, Justine?
I was just going to say he's just the most incredible physician. I say all the time, I've been in this field for almost 12 years now. And I can still say out of all of the doctors that I've met that many of them are incredible physicians. There's still nobody that I've met that's working in the same universe as him. The way that he practices is really through a 7-level, 7-layer model. And so there's no stone left unturned. And he really practices medicine more like an art. So he has a really phenomenal way of working patients up and treating them and gets incredible results. So it's been really great working beside him, and I've learned an enormous amount.
That's awesome. I'm thinking I need to see if you can pull some strings for me so I can talk to him on my podcast, because I'd like to chat with him, especially now
Yeah,
that you've given
yeah,
such a great plug. So no
yeah.
pressure, but okay, we'll
Happy
see what we can
next
work
year.
out.
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you. Just where you mentioned about mast cell activation, I'm just kind of a random question here. Well, not random, but just a kind of random question about MCAS. Of all the folks that you've worked with over the years, or that you've kind of heard about through by proxy, like other like patients at the clinic, whether you're working with them or hearing about them, what percentage of patients who are super, super sensitive, like those folks that are, universal reactors, or they can only eat like, 3 foods and everything else flares them up, or they can't tolerate any supplements because everything flares them up unless you start with baby doses and gradually build up and this and that. All those super sensitive patients, in your experience, what approximate percentage of them would you say it winds up that there's a mast cell activation component with them?
Well, everyone that I see has a mast cell component. So
So
I
100%.
say 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that and it's really ramped up, unfortunately, just since COVID. And we see a lot from vaccinations inducing mast cell activation syndrome. So I work with patients all the time that are coming and only able to consume 5, 6, 7 foods. Now, I do want to say that a lot of it, I think, is, and I don't want to come across as people thinking that I think this is in their head, because that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that regulation becomes a key component to treatment, because there's such a heightened stress response. The amygdala is so enlarged in so many of these patients. And I think a lot of it, their reactions are coming from fear of reacting to foods. And we know that stress will cause mast cells to degranulate. So that's one of many triggers. But I have noticed working with patients that the most important piece of the treatment and getting them to be able to consume more foods is bioregulation, somatic experience therapy, doing neurofeedback, just really, really working on regulating their nervous system.
I hope folks listening are really paying attention to that, where, yeah, just that nervous system regulation seems to be so important. I think probably the last, like, I don't know, 9 of my 12 guests have all said, like, yeah, like the really sensitive folks, the really sick folks, where it's really hard to make headway. Like, it's that nervous system regulation therapy, whether it's amygdala retraining or somatic experiencing, neurofeedback, that kind of thing, like just so important. So you're yet another one mentioning this. And so when you keep hearing the same thing again and again from these folks that are steeped in this field, just again, note to the listeners, it's something really to pay attention to. It's so much, quote unquote, easier to, like, oh, just I'll take the right herb or the right pill. And like, those are all so important in many cases. But that nervous system work, it can be really, really important. We just keep hearing it again and again. So appreciate you emphasizing that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that it's being talked about, because I do feel as if so many people are so focused on, we call it level 2 because of Dr. Hoffman's level 7-layer model, but so focused on the biochemical piece. And I always say that the biochemistry is really the easiest piece to fix. It's everything else, that requires a lot of work on the patient's part. So we're always looking for the next supplement or the, next shiny penny in the nutraceutical world that's going to help to heal or suppress symptoms. And it really comes down to, in so many cases, just getting those patients regulated. And that's where you see so much healing occur.
Yeah, it's really important to have it on the radar for sure. You did mention neurofeedback, and neurofeedback's very much on my brain, no pun intended, in that I'm just in the process in my clinic of starting to work with neurofeedback. That we bought a brain mapping system, and we're just about to launch it like next week. I'm just wondering if does somebody at the Hoffman Center do neurofeedback, or do you folks refer out for that, or what's your experience with that?
Yeah, that's a huge piece of Bruce's treatment and workup is doing brain mapping. So we have somebody in the clinic that does the brain mapping, and then Bruce will read it. But yeah, it's paramount. I have heard him say that he doesn't know if he could practice without that brain map, because it's so critical for developing a roadmap for those patients for treatment.
That's amazing. Do you know offhand which system you folks use in the clinic, which company it is?
I don't know. That would be a good question for him. I'm
Okay.
hardly ever in the clinic. Brian, I do all of my appointments online now.
Oh, I
So
see.
I
Okay.
basically go to the clinic to say hi to the girls and to do IVs, and that's pretty much it at this point.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I'll have to pick his brain on the side. Just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm completely like obsessed with it right now, and that's like all I'm looking into. Like where you're looking into cell membrane stuff all the time, I'm the neurofeedback guy right now. So, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing all of that. And kind of circling around to more of the biochemical piece. Actually, sorry. Before we get there, I'm sure folks listening are wondering like, what are the other 7 layers, or what are the other 6 layers? So do you mind just giving us like the elevator pitch on the 7 layers, and just speak to that for a couple minutes if you don't mind?
Well, you know what? I'm going to leave that for you to talk to Dr. Hoffman about it, because he does such an eloquent. I mean, he speaks to 7 layers so eloquently. But there is the environmental piece, there's the biochemical piece or the physical piece. He does electromagnetic testing. He always does a workup in patient's home with somebody that will come in and do a whole assessment of electromagnetic fields. He works on the soul level, the mind, the spirit. So there's a lot to it. So I really would encourage you to I'll definitely get you guys in touch, because the way that he explains how he practices is really, I will not do it justice. You'll want to hear it from him.
Okay, that's a very good lead up. So you've got my curiosity peaked. So great. Well, I'll hopefully be able to chat with him pretty soon. So as far as the kind of on that biochemical level, and if where phospholipids and membrane support and whatnot would be on that level, I would assume that's on that biochemical level. So could you just speak to kind of the importance of cell membrane support, and maybe just kind of a little bit more of a bird's eye view level, like why should we care about that? Why should we care about cell membranes? And then maybe from there we can kind of talk about what types of therapeutics might be helpful to support the cell membranes and what kind of clinical impact we might see from that. But maybe just starting us off with a bird's eye view of, why should we care about our cell membrane integrity, or any membrane integrity, maybe mitochondrial membranes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, our membranes are everything. So when we look at disease, we always need to look back at the cell, because the structure and the function of your cells is what determines your health. And so when we have a breakdown on the cellular level, when we look at the cell membrane, every one of our cells, every one of the trillions of cells that make up the human body and the 200 different cell types have these biological membranes. And the biological membranes, there's an outer and an inner membrane. The outer is primarily comprised of phosphatidylcholine, and then the inner membrane is primarily comprised of phosphatidylethanolamine, phosphatidylainositol, and phosphatidylserine. So the first thing is the body is all about compartmentalization. So we compartmentalize from cell to cell with these biological membranes. And then we also have that same level of compartmentalization inside the cell with these biological membranes. So you're exactly right when it comes to the mitochondrial membrane. The mitochondria membrane has that outer and inner membrane. There's also an innermost membrane in the mitochondrial as well, called the cardiolipin. And that actually, we'll talk a little bit about essential fatty acids if you're open to going there, and the importance of linoleic acid for healthy mitochondrial functioning. But just to go back to the cell membrane, when we look at the cell membrane, everything is happening on the cell membrane. all of our proteins, all our peptides, all of our receptors, all of our ion channels, this is all happening on the membrane. So when we improve the structure and the function of our cell membrane, and we improve the fluidity of those fatty acid tails on the phosphatidylcholine molecule, we are simultaneously improving every marker of health. So it is, Brian, for me, even just going back to my training and through IFM and every training that I've done over the last 12 years in this field, it was really understanding the power of lipid replacement therapy, restoring the health of the cell membrane, that made everything make sense to me and really make me question why we are not talking about this more, because it really is the true foundation of our health. We're all made of cells. And even when we look at it through a personalized medicine lens, everybody needs phospholipids. Everybody needs essential fatty acid support. So that should be a conversation. Not that I want to should anyone, but I would hope that that's a conversation in every single integrative medical practice, because otherwise, we're not really going to get very far long term. Even when we think about nutrients that are getting into the cell and waste that are removed from the cell, that is all dependent on healthy cell membrane.
One question on that. So, and you hear these numbers, enough people say it at conferences, you're like, oh, yeah, it's probably true, but it's hard to find time to fact check everything. So one of the things I've been meaning to fact check, and always a million things to look into, but I've heard once upon a time that something to the effect of like 70% of all of our phospholipids are phosphatidylcholine. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about the specific makeup of the inner membrane versus the outer membrane. But have you heard a similar number? Do you know offhand if that's true, or is that old school, out of date knowledge? What's the overall percentage of phosphatidylcholine, if you happen to know?
The outer membrane is roughly about 50% phosphatidylcholine. And then the inner membrane, the primary phospholipid in the inner membrane is the primary phospholipid in the inner membrane is phosphatidylethynolamine. So those phospholipids are making up the majority of the membrane, but we also have cholesterol and those fatty acid tails I talked about. So when you look at a phosphatidylcholine molecule, there's a polar head group or a choline component. So that's what a lot of people will say, that's our essential nutrient, choline. So that's much different than phosphatidylcholine, which for whatever reason is used interchangeably, even in the scientific literature. They'll call sunflower lecithin or triple lecithin phosphatidylcholine. But that's very different. That's something that I think is really important for people and patients to understand too, the difference between most phosphatidylcholine supplements on the market and the body bio PC. This is where it just blows all the other supplements out of the water, because it's the actual molecule, the phosphatidylcholine molecule, the phosphatidylethynolamine, that formula is pure phospholipids. So you're really giving your body those exact substrates that it needs to go in and repair damage to the cell membrane, to repair the mitochondrial membrane. You don't have to take, when you consume lecithin, sunflower lecithin or soy lecithin, that's going to get broken down in the gut by lipase and digestive enzymes into choline and fatty acids. And then that needs to go through either the CDP choline or Kennedy pathway, or the methyltransferase choline system, or through the de novo synthesis pathway to make phospholipids. So that's where there's a huge discrepancy between these, the body bio PC as an example, and taking a lecithin powder. You really want to make sure that you're providing your body with those pure phospholipids, especially when we're working with people that are chronically ill, because then we're giving those people the exact materials that they need to repair their membrane. And when we think about, I use this analogy a lot because I think it's really important to think about our biochemistry just like we would our bank account. If we were to only take withdrawals out of our bank account over the course of our life and never put valuable deposits in, most of us would end up bankrupt. And our biochemistry is the same way. So when we get chronic illness or disease or have all these symptoms manifest, it's a sign that we're biochemically bankrupt. And these phospholipids and essential fatty acids are such valuable deposits in that biochemical bank account. So we can really move the needle a huge way when we supplement with these phospholipids and fatty acids to repair the membrane, repair the mitochondria membrane from the cell danger response, and ultimately restore health.
I have some follow-up questions on that. Thank you for that. And just before I get to my questions, I always forget this at the start, but just for as in every episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast, nothing that we're saying should be construed as medical advice. This is all for informational purposes only. If you need any medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. So just kind of circling back to something that you said in that last little section. So like, for example, there's I won't name any companies, not that this is, CME approved for credits or anything, but just so we don't throw anybody under the bus here inadvertently. But there's a company and, we carry their, phosphatidylcholine supplement, or maybe I'll say in quotes, phosphatidylcholine supplement. And on the label, it says, each gel cap contains, 420 milligrams of phosphatidylcholine, full stop. So, am I correct to assume that unless that's, a very specific company offering a very specific product, that's probably not actually phosphatidylcholine? It might just be choline, or at the very least, it's the type that's going to get broken down and not absorbed 100%. Am I understanding that correctly?
There's only two brands that I know that are sold that are pure phospholipids. So BodyBio is one of them, and then there's another company out of Europe that's pharmaceutical grade, and it's double the price of the BodyBio PC. So much more of an investment. But yeah, yes, that you would be right. It's likely lecithin, sunflower or soy lecithin.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what it says it's derived from, but then it does say like 420 milligrams per capsule of like phosphatidylcholine. But anyways, please go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the ways that you can tell if it's a true phospholipid is if you mix that product with water in a blender on high. So you'd want to do equal parts the product with equal parts filtered water, blend that in a Vitamix for 30 seconds on high, and you should get this beautiful mixture that validates that it's actually a liposome. Most of the products you'll see, it separates. It doesn't combine. And so that's your indication that it's likely going to get broken down in the gut. Not that that can't be beneficial for some people, but there are also contraindications to taking lecithin. You see in the literature that lecithin can raise TMAO. Whether or not that's a bad thing is kind of still a big question mark, but you will see TMAO levels rise. And then you also need to consider patients that have SNPs in the CDP choline or Kennedy pathway or methylation issues. That's another really important thing for people to understand, is that we focus a lot on B6, B12, and folate to support methylation and the recycling of homocysteine. But the foundation of that system is phosphatidylcholine and actually creatine. So we can use phosphatidylcholine to take the load off of that system. So for every gram of PC that we consume in supplement form is actually a gram that our body doesn't need to make. So we're freeing up all the space for repair. So I always remind people that when we're supporting methylation, yes, we need B6, B12, and folate to support the recycling, but we can also artificially lower homocysteine if we're not supporting the foundation of that system with phosphatidylcholine and creatine. So there's just so many benefits to it. Phosphatidylcholine also regulates the reverse cholesterol transport system. So when we look at people's HDL markers, there's a lot of people that have low HDL. So we know those people are really going to benefit from phosphatidylcholine because it's going to regulate it and hopefully bring it up to where we want it, between 60 and 90. Those are US measurements. And then also we know that when people have high levels of HDL, it's often dysfunctional. So we don't want to be celebrating HDL levels above 90 because it's usually a dysfunctional HDL. And we can use PC to help to regulate that as well.
You mentioned earlier before we started recording that you're used to a US-based podcast, so you've got all your US numbers down. It's like, oh man, if you had like 90 in Canadian units, like, oh my gosh, you're more cholesterol than human at that point. It's funny how those scales are so different. And for folks who are interested, I believe if you divide by 38.6, that'll get you into the Canadian units. So nice round number there, that 38.6. So yeah, few questions stemming from what you just said there, Justine. So super fascinating. Could you just speak a little bit more to how, if a person had, because actually I just followed up with a patient late last week that, they had quite a high HDL. He was 2.7, which whatever multiply that by 38.6, and that's what it is in American units. So like, fairly high HDL, all things considered. And so you're insinuating that that's maybe not a good sign, that's showing some sign of dysfunction. And if I'm understanding you correctly, could you just elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, so my training when I the lipid researcher or the scientist that mentored me had said that anything above 90 is really dysfunctional. So we often have a really myopic focus on a lot of markers. Uric acid is another one where it's the lower the uric acid, the better, but low uric acid is correlated with neurodegenerative disease. So, there's a Goldilocks effect with a lot of these markers, and HDL is another marker that has that Goldilocks effect. So typically when levels are really high, that system is not working properly. So for anyone that doesn't know what HDL does, that's the reverse cholesterol transport system. So that's passively removing excess cholesterol from the cell membrane. So really, really important to support healthy cell membrane structure and function, and also intimately connected with things like cancer and neurological diseases and cardiovascular disease. It's really helping to control inflammation in the body. So we want to make sure that we have a healthy range of HDL, and I was always taught that high levels are an indication that system is not working efficiently and it's dysfunctional.
So if there's HDL is too high, like say over 90 in US units, then that's an indication that maybe that HDL is not actually doing what we think that it should be doing, like that there's a lot of it, but it's just not working very well, and you're actually maybe not taking the cholesterol away from where it should be taken away from.
Exactly. So same consequences as having low
Oh, wow.
HDL. Yeah.
Interesting. And that taking an actual phosphatidylcholine supplement would help to correct those levels.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. PC
Hmm.
regulates that whole system.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Just taking some notes here, so excuse my arm getting into the video here. Um, okay. And over what kind of time frame, like if you had a patient on the right dose of PC and like other phospholipids, what like would you expect that to normalize? Like, does it take 3 months, 6 months, a year? Like how long does it take to get those numbers looking better?
You actually see pretty great improvements, I would say, within 3 to 6 months of supplementing. And you had mentioned, Brian, that capsule that you're using clinically is 450 milligrams. So I do want to just say that clinically we use very high doses. So we're using usually about 2 tablespoons of the Body Bio PC. And so just to kind of give you an idea, I would have to do the math, but half a teaspoon of the PC is going to provide you with 1,300 milligrams of phospholipids. So because it's a complex, it doesn't have the exact breakdown of each specific phospholipid. So PC, PE, PI, and PS. It just has a total. But just to give you an idea, we use, up to 2 tablespoons. So we're using
That's
much
a
higher
robust
than the
dose.
450, the 450 milligrams. And that's really what we've seen. We do, Bruce does very extensive testing. So he doesn't just, throw darts in the dark. But that is what we have found is the dose that is really needed for most people to restore mitochondrial dysfunction. And remember, PC has so many it's such a powerful detoxification agent. So many people that are sick, and we're all riddled with toxins. I mean, anybody that thinks that they're not is really delusional in all due respect. And I've been really humbled by that too. I mean, I just had a test done in February, and I really, really that person that lives the most non-toxic lifestyle as possible. I know that I have no control over toxins when I exit my home, but when it comes to body products and cleaning products and food and, blocking EMFs and, kind of doing all the things. And even my test results were so tragic when it came to, the level of toxins that I had in my membrane attached to my DNA. And so it's unavoidable. And so we can really use PC not only to help remove all those toxins, but we can use it prophylactically to help prevent toxins from accumulating in the cell. Because when we have adequate amounts of phospholipids in the cell membrane, toxins are actually not able to get into the cell. It acts as a barrier to entry. So there's no room for them. And then phosphatidylcholine is also able to work its way into the cell and remove intracellular toxins, remove toxins that have attached to your DNA. We call those DNA adducts. And that is one of the main reasons why I got into this whole field, because I saw like clockwork. Patients would come in, they had such severe mitochondrial dysfunction, they were riddled with toxins, and within 9 months, we'd retest after taking the PC for about 9 months, and their test would be completely clear. So it's really, really phenomenal how we can use this essential nutrient that's helping to support the body in all aspects, but it's also simultaneously helping to support detoxification.
Sounds very good. And I'm just curious, much more questions here. Every time you talk, it's like there's 5 more questions. We're never going to get to all of them, Justine, but we'll do our best. Oh geez, and then I just lost it after that little preamble there. Oh, right. The test for, and so I'm paraphrasing here, but like toxins bound to your DNA, like was that an 8-OHDG level, or is that some other test that was looking at toxins bound to your DNA?
Yeah, no, we run the IGL out of Germany, so it's an epigenetic
Um,
mitochondrial test.
oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I heard about them. We haven't taken the plunge yet into looking into it. But what's so it's the IGL lab is the name of the
IGL
lab?
lab.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Are there other tests beyond the IGL lab testing that would kind of be used to assess for indicators that would suggest a person might need more phospholipids?
Yeah, the red blood cell fatty acid test actually done through BodyBio is one of my favorites. So that's done actually through the Kennedy Krieger lab at the Johns Hopkins University. And that's the gold standard for fatty acid testing. And then BodyBio provides the wellness report for practitioners. It's an incredible test. It was actually the reason why I went and studied essential fatty acids, because of the whole narrative around fish oil and everybody supplementing with fish oil. And I would see on all these tests, almost all of the tests. And that's really, really honest. I know that we hear this narrative that everybody is overdosing on omega-6s and has way too much omega-6, but I would see the opposite clinically, where all these people were taking high dose fish oil, and because of taking high dose fish oil, they tank their entire linoleic acid side. And, it results in things like demyelinating, because our myelin is our main fatty acids in myelin are linoleic acid and arachidonic acid, outside of phosphatidylcholine being the main phospholipid in myelin. So these fatty acids, balancing them and having that harmony between the two essential fatty acids is so incredibly important. And on that BodyBio red blood cell fatty acid test, again, done through the Kennedy Krieger lab, you can see the 2 essential parent oils and all of the downstream metabolites. You have a myelination index, you have peroxisomal function. So our peroxisomes, for everyone that's listening, are also little organelles in the cell. They work very closely with the mitochondria to beta oxidize fatty acids. And so you'll see when there's a buildup of things like very long chain fatty acids or renegade fatty acids or saturated odd, you know that your peroxisomes are likely under a lot of stress and not beta oxidizing those fatty acids properly. So that's a beautiful marker, but mostly just to kind of go back to those 2 essential fatty acids, I really was able to see clearly how detrimental it is to our cellular health when we're taking fish oil, or, even just eating fish too often and not supporting our mother essential fatty acid, which is linoleic acid, which is another reason why I love the BodyBio balance oil for that reason, because you're providing patients or individuals with a 4-to-1 ratio of linoleic acid to alpha linolenic. So that's the perfect ratio that we want. We want a 4-to-1 to optimize cellular health and fluidity. And too much fish oil, because those polyunsaturated fatty acids have a lot of fluidity, it actually will facilitate a leaky cell membrane. So we can have a leaky gut, a leaky blood-brain barrier, but we can also have leaky cell membranes, and we can actually facilitate that by just overdosing fish oil. So I always tell people to proceed with caution with fish oil supplementation, and to just always really make sure that you're supporting the omega-6 side as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. There's only one other person I've heard talk about how like, oh, like maybe we need more omega-6s than omega-3s, and I'm blanking on his name, but I know he uses a term like parent essential oil, which is like you need a different term because then people think of essential oils. What was that you said? Sorry.
Ryan Peskin.
That's the one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And remember, yeah, I always think of fish with peskin. So yeah, that's the mnemonic that I forgot. Yeah. So is that kind of is he the main driver of that information, or is he just tapping into the same literature that the body bio folks are tapping into? Do you know?
Just tapping into the same literature. Yeah, I know of his work well, but he's not who I originally learned that from. There's many lipid researchers that teach that. I feel like they've been kind of lost in the woods. Again, just with a lot of the research around omega-3s. And I know a lot of these studies that come out are very short-term studies, and omega-3s have lots of powerful anti-inflammatory properties. But I always remind people that they do have the ability to suppress the immune system. So you will see really profound anti-inflammatory benefit short term, but long term, high dose fish oil and overdoing that one essential fatty acid is, yeah, not ideal.
Um, with I know when I heard, I think it was on the Better Health Guy podcast, one of my favorite podcasters of all time. When he interviewed Brian Peskin, if I'm recalling correctly, Mr. Peskin was saying there's what is it like most of the labs will have just kind of reference ranges for like the omega-3, the omega-6, like the fatty acid profiles that really just sort of unfairly favor the omega-3s. Does the body bio, do those reports like kind of factor that in more, or do you have to kind of take the results with a little bit of a grain of salt with looking at those specific ratios on the report?
They don't do ratios, Brian. They do
Ah,
actual concentrations in the cell membrane.
I see.
So yeah, so it's very different than a lot of these other fatty acid tests that they're giving you a percentile. And the percentile, I don't know what every lab is using in terms of ratio, but I know a lot of labs use a 2-to-1 ratio from the
Mhm.
linoleic acid to the omega-3 side. And I just haven't seen, I personally don't believe that's supported by the literature. So the literature that I've read is almost across the board, either a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio from the omega-6 to the omega-3.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Thank you for getting into the weeds with that with me. I'd like to ask you a few clinical questions if you don't mind, or things that are a little more clinically related. But was there anything else you wanted to say on that topic before we move on?
No,
Okay.
that's
Great. So something that you said earlier, and I may be extrapolating from it a bit, but I'm now going to paraphrase and extrapolate. So I'd like to get your 2 cents on this. So have you had patients where they've been on, say lots of good biochemical support, they've been, getting their treatment for, mold toxicity, Lyme, et cetera, whatever it happens to be, they're dealing with their complex chronic illnesses, they've had good protocol in place, but they haven't yet had the cream of the crop phospholipid replacement therapy done. And so the phospholipid replacement therapy is one of, the only, or it's the only new variable that's brought into their picture. And that's led to clinical changes. Subtext for the question is that, I know with some clinicians, they're like, oh, I'm going to put you on this, but we're going to bring in like this and this too and change the diet. And of course, we change multiple things at once because we want people to get better lickety split. But I'm just wondering, to what extent have you seen phospholipid replacement as like essentially a single variable make a big difference for folks suffering from complex chronic illness? Sounds like it'd help with HDL dysfunction as a single variable, but in terms of say fatigue or brain fog or pain or whatever it happens to be, could you speak to your experience with that as kind of an isolated variable for folks?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what I said earlier about I truly believe that it is the single most important treatment to implement phospholipids and essential fatty acids because of what I've seen clinically. Because you don't only see a complete transformation on labs, you see patient testimonials. Patients say they feel better. So there's a lot of supplements that we use, and I don't know if you've had this experience as well, that you'll see labs improve, but that doesn't always equate to the patient saying that they feel the benefit of the supplements. But over time now with phospholipids and fatty acids, when you're repairing the membrane, you're repairing trillions of cells and even more mitochondria. So it takes time. So people don't always notice an improvement right away. but I can say that after patients have been on those products for 9 months to a year, you see incredible improvements. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't use other treatments. I mean, Bruce implements lots of different treatment modalities, but that's always the foundational treatment. I mean, every single patient is on phospholipid and fatty acid support. So I don't really know exactly how to answer that question because, again, it's not just one thing that we're doing, but it is that one thing that I know on the IGL, when you look into that test, even talking to the scientist that created that lab, he will say that anything that's wrong with that test, the treatment is phosphatidylcholine. That's the power of
Okay.
phosphatidylcholine.
Okay.
And when you think about how much of a role it plays, again, in helping to support the structure and the integrity of the cell, and all of the other benefits of making sure that we have adequate amounts of those phospholipids, and how the cell, as we age, we have a decreased ability to make these phospholipids. We have higher levels of oxidative stress and inflammation and catabolic reactions. We have more damage to the cell membrane. And if we don't have what we need to go in and repair that damage, I mean, that breakdown on a cellular level is what is going to end up with a disease state. So it is, whether you're sick or not, I really truly believe that everybody on the planet should be on them. Even when you look at the literature, Brian, around brain atrophy, the neurons shrink like a raisin. It shrinks from the inside out. So you see, a breakdown of the structure of the membrane that ends up with the neuron dying. And so there's researchers that are hypothesizing now that we could actually potentially mitigate that brain atrophy that we see. We see about a 20% between the ages of 50 and 80. That we could potentially mitigate that using lipid replacement therapy. So, the benefits are they're so profound, and there's so many that I just really believe that every patient should be on them. And when it comes to chronic complex illness, even with mast cell activation syndrome, we know that those mast cells, the granules that hold those inflammatory chemical mediators, are on the membrane. So when those mast cells are degranulating, triggers that they shouldn't be degranulating from, we know that we can move the needle in such a big way by providing structure to that cell membrane, repairing the damage of the membrane. So even with that condition, I mean, lipid replacement therapy is so key.
That's really awesome. And yeah, I had the thought like maybe 2 or 3 years ago of like, oh, like mast cell activation, like, if we can just stabilize those mast cells, like literally stabilize the cell membrane, like that should have a notable impact. And I feel like some of the therapies I've worked with to strive for that have been helpful for MCAS patients. So of course, we have such limited natural products available, like limited natural products and pharmaceuticals, and like you run out of options. Like, what are we going to do for this poor person? Well, let's maybe try some other things. That's great that you that's something that's been part of your paradigm as well. Also, just to say comment on just to say, I think folks should really pay attention to what you're saying about this, because I ask other guests and other clinicians outside of the podcast as well all the time, like, oh, like you love this product, like what is your observation with it as a single therapy, or like this is a one individual variable like on top of the existing protocol, like in terms of moving the needle. And to be perfectly frank, in my opinion, like a lot of the times it's like I don't really get the most satisfactory answer. It's more of like, yeah, well, like I'm pretty sure it helps. Like, but I just think folks should really pay attention to what you're saying here, Justine, because it sounds like you've looked at this like very critically, and it's like what variable stands out? Like this is standing shoulders above other things. So I just think folks listening should really pay attention to this. I'm paying attention. I'm excited about it. You've got me revved up and raring to go here. So I'm definitely going to look into this more for my patients. To be honest, I've gone through several phases of like, all the literature is like, and logic would dictate we need more phospholipids. And yet, like, I've tried this and that, like, sunflower lecithin, soy lecithin, this and that product. And like, it's some patients will experience some benefit, and like, for the most part, not. So I'm like, okay, I've tried it, failed. But, it sounds like there might be a key element here where it's not the sort of intact phospholipids and, that maybe we've been working with. So I'm going to give it another try. I'm motivated.
Yeah.
To try again.
Well, Brian, just to build on that, I do want to say that was our experience too before we found Body Bio.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So it was Body Bio's product that move the needle in the way that we see the needle move. So I do feel, I always like to share this with clinicians that I didn't get trained by Body Bio. That wasn't, I saw the benefit of their product. And that was the whole reason why I wanted to pursue my learnings in phospholipids and fatty acids. It was because of their products. So they are so close to my heart. I believe in them wholeheartedly. And when you see, I mean, thousands of patients at this point, we put them on phospholipids. And when you see the benefit that they bring, you really, I mean, I am 1000% convinced that it is the most important thing to have in your practice. And especially even just the more and more that I learn about their qualities, when you think about like electromagnetic fields are a perfect example. We are all living in a soup of EMFs. And the mechanism of action is these electromagnetic frequencies directly damage our membrane. And so we're not living in a world anymore where, you know, the toxin assault is low. I mean, we're bombarded by them constantly, now, especially with these EMFs. And so if we don't have an abundance of phospholipids to go in and repair damage to the membrane that we're getting damaged every second of every day, we're going to end up in a really dire state of health. And so, and even I think for me, when you've had that experience, I mean, I have mast cell activation syndrome. I've had mold illness. I've been through so many of these seasons of my life that patients that I work with have been through or are going through. And I can say that it was not until I felt like I did everything. And it was not until I started phospholipid therapy that I finally experienced symptom relief. And I even notice it now if I miss a couple days, I mean, my body craves them. It's like my body is calling for them. So I mean, they're such a nourishing, and I think that everybody, for the most part, that is in tune with their body and with what you need and is eating a whole foods diet and really nutrient dense will feel that way too, that it's just like the nutrients that you were missing and that your body needs so desperately.
It's a pretty glowing testimonial, Justine, and 1000% convinced. You can't argue with 1000%. So it's awesome. And one of the things that I look at, a lens through which I look at a lot of things with my patients and just kind of health and physiology in general is like, well, what did nature intend? Did nature intend us to like be taking these like, phospholipid supplements and this and that? It's like, well, sure, we're going to get, phospholipids from various foods like, egg yolks and various things like that. I think duck fat's really high in phospholipids if memory serves, but so poor ducks, chasing those around. Don't go eat all the ducks in your community, folks. But it's like, as you make the very good point that like, yeah, we're being bombarded by all this electromagnetic radiation, all these different chemicals. Like, I've heard stats that like, 94% of people who are tested for glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, like, we're testing positive for that. And so like, just, I hate to say it, like the naturopathic part of my brain's like, no, just like go eat organic food, get some sunshine, have some, good sleep, and like everything's going to be fine. But like, it's not a fair playing field. It's not 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We've got, heck, it's not 30 years ago, when I was, fairly young, still growing up. Like, so on the one hand, it's like kind of sad and depressing to hear like, oh, I need my phospholipids to feel good. But at the same time, like this is the world we're living in. And if that's what your body needs, you're getting that feedback, then like, so be it, like unless you're going to go move out onto the moon, which might have its own challenges. Like it's just, we've got to buffer the onslaught of things that are around us. And I hate to say it, but if you find those effective tools, it can be really invaluable. So it sounds like this is one of those tools for you anyways, and majority of your patients.
For sure. And I mean, just working in the field of nutrition for as long as I have as well, I don't know if you're doing micro and macronutrient assessments on your patients, but I've had that belief system too, Brian, that we could get everything that we need from food as long as we're eating a whole food, nutrient dense diet. And it's just not reality. Our food system is so depleted, and even those people that are eating all whole foods, nothing processed, eating a good amount of food. They're not calorie restricting. They're, not doing crazy fasting. They're really working on nourishing their body. Nobody is hitting all those targets. I have yet to see one. So. I do think that supplementation and nutraceuticals are key for filling in those gaps.
Um, not to leave things on too low and depressing of a note, bearing in mind there are lots of folks out there that are working to, push back against, chemical contamination and, out there advocating about electromagnetic radiation reduction, et cetera. So don't give up hope, folks. There are, good folks fighting the good fight out there. Anyways, yes, it's a bit of a dire straits, but we'll pull ourselves out of it. We're resilient as a species. A couple other questions I have for you, Justine, just before we wrap up. I feel like I could pick your brain for another hour, but I know we don't have that much time. One just kind of side question that popped into my mind. I was super excited about alpha glycerophosphocholene when I heard about it. Alpha GPC, as some folks might have heard it referred to. It's like you look at the research literature, like helping with neurological function and this and that, and like it was just another disappointing phospholipid chapter in my life. Tried it with several patients. I think maybe one or two saw some benefit. I took it myself, didn't see any difference. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to any experience you might have with alpha glycerophosphocholene, in contrast to, I know the punchline is going to be body bio products are the best. I get that. Any experience with the alpha GPC that you could share?
So I would strongly advise not using it. I've actually, I was taught, and again, I'm happy to send you the literature on this as well. It's actually high in brains of individuals that have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So we see high levels of that glycerol phospholipid in Alzheimer's brains, Parkinson's, and MS, I believe, was the other neurological condition. It is a completely different animal than taking pure phospholipids to support the membrane. So I would never recommend it. I know that it's been talked about a lot recently, and there's a lot of people taking it. And every time I hear an advertisement on a podcast for alpha GPC, I'm like, no, stop.
Mhm.
You don't want to take it. You just, want to make sure that you're supporting your membranes with pure phospholipids. So I'm not a fan of it at all, but I'm happy to show you. Send me an email after. I'm happy to show you that literature on alpha GPC.
Okay, we'll do. Yeah, I haven't prescribed it in a long time, but yeah, just because it didn't seem to work. But yeah, it sounds like it's actually a bad idea. So okay, thank you for that info. One other quick question, and then I have one other question, and then we'll probably wrap things up because I think we'll be out of time. Um, just in terms of phosphatidylserine, I've also been generally fairly underwhelmed with phosphatidylserine. For I know some folks take it for as kind of like an adrenal support supplement, some folks for cognitive support, etc. I guess kind of two-part question. Do the BioBody products have phosphatidylserine in their mix? I think yes, from what you said earlier, and you're nodding. And any experience with folks, it's like, oh, taking a phosphatidylserine supplement, because I would presume that's not just sunflower lecithin in there. I assume that's, standardized a bit more to actually having phosphatidylserine in there. But could you speak to phosphatidylserine supplements a little bit?
Yeah, so first of all, the Body Bio PC does have serine in it. And remember, with the complex, you're getting those phospholipids from a whole food form in the ideal ratios of PC, PE, PI, and PS. So phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamine, phosphatidylinositol, and phosphatidylserine. The research that I've read on phosphatidylserine, so you want to keep those phospholipids in the appropriate concentration. That's how we're going to help to support the health of the membrane. High dose phosphatidylserine supplementation actually can induce cell death by flipping the cell membrane when those concentrations become out of balance. So I'm not a supporter of high dose phosphatidylserine supplementation. I think if you were to use it to help to blunt cortisol for a short period of time, you're probably not going to run into too much trouble. But I definitely wouldn't recommend high dose phosphatidylserine supplementation long term, just because of that literature that I've read about it inducing cell death and flipping the cell membrane.
Okay. And just probably my last question here. You mentioned earlier about how there's when you supplement with both creatine and phospholipids, it helps to take a lot of the burden off of the body's methylation demands, which, yeah, really important point. One of the many things I was disappointed in with my previous forays into phospholipids was like, it didn't really seem to help the folks that I was hoping it would take the burden off their methylation cycles. So excited to hopefully see that working in my practice, taking a different approach. So just in my experience with more direct methylation support, in terms of, say high dose methylcobalamin, or even just, reasonable doses or maybe higher doses of methylfolate, some folks can just really flare like crazy. Various mechanisms by which that might happen, but I'm just wondering if, as you're titrating up, say, the dose of intact phospholipids, do you see detox symptoms that seem to be related to overmethylation kind of by proxy, or how are the phospholipids generally tolerated?
They're generally tolerated very well. You will, because I work with so many individuals who have mast cell activation syndrome, I think I see more sensitivity to the phospholipids than most people would. So in that demographic of patient, you want to start really low and slow for sure. Now, phospholipids also have signaling properties. So there is the potential that, I think this is probably happening in a lot of the reactions, that those phospholipids are acting as signaling molecules, and that signaling is degranulating the mast cells and causing, those 1,000 chemical mediators to be released. And then that's initiating these multi-system, multi-organ symptoms. They also, remember, a changing brain chemistry. So a lot of people well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but you will run into individuals who say they have brain fog, or they get some sort of cognitive symptoms associated with introducing phospholipids. And that is likely just the change in the brain chemistry and the brain acclimating to those new levels of phospholipids. So obviously we don't want to push through symptoms that are causing us to be, bedridden. But I think for most people, if the symptoms are tolerable, those are going to subside relatively quickly, especially as you build up your levels. We start patients on about half a teaspoon or a quarter of a teaspoon, generally, if they're sensitive, and then highly sensitive people will start on an eighth of a teaspoon, and then slowly work that dose up over the course of a couple of weeks to more of a therapeutic dose. And I had mentioned before, we're using about 2 tablespoons, I'd say, on average, in most patients that are chronically ill. Of course, it depends on the weight of the patient and metabolic demand. There's lots of factors that go into that. But the thing is, those symptoms are not necessarily, a lot of people associate them with detoxification. I don't really think that a quarter of a teaspoon or half a teaspoon, or even a teaspoon, is going to be enough to really cause detox symptoms. I think if you're getting a PCIV, that could be a possibility, but I don't think those low doses are going to contribute to those symptoms. I think it would be more likely that it's a mast cell symptom, and they're causing, the signaling properties are causing the mast cell to degranulate, and then creating those symptoms to manifest. But I also don't have, everybody is so different. That's one thing working with people in general. Everyone is so different, and you can read research all day long, and it doesn't always equate to, it almost never actually equates to, clinical practice, clinical experience. So
There's definitely a disconnect there for some things anyways, but yeah, it's all just piecing it together and doing the best we can and having these conversations and sharing experience. And yeah. Um, well, Justine, thank you for all the information. And again, I do have probably a half dozen other questions off the top of my head, but maybe we can chat again at some point down the road, if you're available. Just before we wrap things up, would you be able to just share how folks can get in touch with you, either via social, like where are you on social media? Do you have any online offerings? If folks want to work with you directly, what are the options that they have?
Yeah, so I'm at Justine Cellular Nutrition on Instagram, and I'm really active on Instagram. As you know, I do a lot of educational reels on Instagram. And then on my link tree and my link in bio, there's links to get in touch with me if you want to book a session, and products that I love, etc. I would also encourage people to look at the Body Bio website. They have so much information, so many blog posts. So if you're interested in learning more about cell membrane medicine, about their products. Also, you can always send me a DM on Instagram if you have questions about any of the products or about cellular health, mitochondrial health. I'm always happy to support people in the best way that I can. Obviously, I can't give medical advice, but happy to answer any non-medical questions.
And yeah, as I said in my little intro I recorded before we started chatting, I very much enjoy your Instagram posts. You always have interesting topics. That's the reason I reached out to see if you chat with me, because yeah, you definitely talk about a lot of things, and it's definitely not generic posting and whatnot. So it's really, really good content. So definitely worth following Justine if you folks aren't following her already on Instagram. Thank you so much. My pleasure. So thank you so much for your time today, Justine. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we look forward to having a chat again at some point. And thanks so much to everyone for tuning into this episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. We hope that it was educational and informative, and please stay tuned for the next one.